What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you some highlights from our most recent Steam Next Fest, which is currently ongoing from now until the 22nd of June, just before the summer sale starts, I believe. But like all Steam Next Fest, this is about celebrating both recent and upcoming game releases via demos that you can actually play and check out for yourself. And obviously every time this happens, which is a few times a year, I like to jump in and kind of go through them and see if I can find anything interesting. However, as also always, there's a few things to cover here. One, this time around, there are like 5,000 games in this Steam Next Fest. Obviously, I'm not going to be able to cover all of those. And to that end, if you found any interesting demos you'd like me to check out, drop them down below, and I very well may do so. What's more, there's always inevitable confusion around this. So Steam Next Fest will feature a bunch of games that sometimes have had demos before this. Some games will only have the demo available during the Steam Next Fest, and then some games will continue to have those demos available. The event itself is just about giving some marketing and highlighting games that might not otherwise get it, as difficult as that is with 5,000 participants, mind you. But when it comes to the availability of these demos both before and after the event, it really is a case-by-case basis. There's not necessarily a ton of rhyme or reason to it. But with that stuff out of the way, let's dive in and get talking about them. So we actually pretty recently got a fair bit of Vampire the Masquerade news, and one of those games that I haven't covered yet was actually Vampire the Masquerade Oaths Ashes. This is an upcoming visual novel set in, of course, the World of Darkness franchise. However, this is effectively a narrative game, of which Vampire the Masquerade has spawned quite a few, and truth be told, a lot of them are pretty good. They're a bit of a guilty pleasure of mine, even if I admit the audience for them is a bit niche. In this particular case, we take on the role of a vampire attempting to become an Archon, which, if you're not familiar with what that is, you can look into some of the power structures of the Camarilla, at which point you'll get a better idea of kind of the hierarchy here. But it's an interesting thing to play around with in a game like this, and they take it a bit farther by dropping you into Berlin and being in a bit of a power struggle that takes place over some interactions, and it's attempting to do some things you don't necessarily see visual novels do, which was of interest to me. Keeping it moving, however, next up we do have a game I have covered already and plan to review as it releases in just a couple of days, in fact, and that is the Adventures of Elliot Millennium Tales, which is a terrible name for an otherwise interesting game that harkens back to old school Zelda titles. I enjoyed this demo a lot. I think if you try it for yourself, you may very well as well. But again, I'll be reviewing this one, so I'm going to keep it short and sweet there, and go ahead and move on to our next entry of Edge of Memories. Edge of Memories is an upcoming JRPG that is being published by Nacon, which is of note for a variety of recent reasons around their financial struggles, but nonetheless, this game has a playable demo out that puts you in the role of Aline, I think it is, who happens to be a soul whisperer, somebody who is capable of diving into somebody's soul and dealing with the problems that trouble them, which is of note given the latest developments of a plague known as the corrosion destroying the world that you were hopefully going to stop. And naturally, you're going to do that by beating everything to death, in this case via action combat. You'll have a couple of people with you who can perform attacks, and you've got your usual assortment of like light, heavy, and dodges. And in many ways, I would honestly say this reminds me a little bit of that recent Visions of Mana title, and I'll likely talk a little bit more about this one in the future. No release date for this one just yet. It is set for Q4 of 2026, but we'll see what happens. It's one of those games I've got my eye on. Speaking of me, however, we then have Valor Mortis. This is a game that is perilously close to my channel name, and just so happens to be a game I am very interested in taking a look at. This game is attempting to be a first-person Souls-like that's mixing some stuff that we've seen in games like BioShock, sure, alongside a surprisingly fluid movement system, though it's my understanding that the people that are making this game also made Ghost Runner, which is known for that kind of thing, so maybe not that much of a surprise all in all. Either way, this game puts you in the role of a resurrected soldier in Napoleon's army who's got to get to the bottom of why they've been resurrected. There's a plague going around. Everyone's using these strange concoctions which seem to have some adverse side effects, let's say. And I'm very interested in to see how that one pans out. This was initially slated for, I think, September, but it recently got pushed out to October to avoid some of those releases that are happening in September, I believe, which is probably for the best. Speaking of September releases, though, a game with a tough release date is none other than Onimusha Way of the Sword, which is a revival of sorts for the Onimusha series. And having played the demo, I've got to say the combat itself is pretty fluid and fun, even if I do hope they add a little bit more difficulty in there personally. But beyond that, it's a pretty engaging experience, with the action combat itself being pretty on point. But like I said, this game's up against a rough release date. It is releasing on September 24th, and September is an extraordinarily busy month as it is, so we'll see how that winds up working out for them, I suppose. Next up is a game that I admit is not my personal taste, but I had heard people talk about it and I wanted to take a look at it for myself, and that was Mistfall Hunter. Mistfall Hunter is an extraction game. That is to say, you get dropped into a map, try to loot a bunch of stuff, and then make your way off of said map by escaping, all along the way while fighting both PvP and PvE elements at the same time. Given the recent success of things like Arc Raiders, I'm not surprised we're seeing even more of these, and extraction games have always been around for some time, but I'll admit the big focus here is naturally going to be multiplayer in its various forms. You can play solo, there is a solo option, but I'd be lying if I said it was for me personally, even if I do think the concept is pretty neat. And if you couldn't tell by looking at it, you play a bunch of varying types of warriors. You pick a class more or less and then do a little character creation before getting into the game itself, being able to customize some skills and of course fight your way through everything you're going to be up against as you try to grab some loot to continue to upgrade your character. Over halfway through now, we then have Corsair Cove. Corsair Cove is a city builder with an interesting twist, that being that you are playing in the golden age of piracy, and what you can do with those buildings is essentially build them straight up sheer cliffs. In the cove you are building up as you try to establish a base of operations for all these pirates who have seen better days, as the golden age of piracy is about to come to an end unless you can do something about it. Now, I gotta be honest, as a city builder, it seems pretty cut and dry, but I did think the aesthetic and the individual ways you could build into the cliffs alongside how you connect those things via like rope bridges and stuff was especially interesting. So there's a certain element there that I haven't seen elsewhere, but otherwise, admittedly, pretty basic city builder by all accounts. Then we had False Hero. False Hero was an interesting little Souls-like title that admittedly I took a look at because it kind of reminded me visually of Dread Delusion. False Hero, though, is really just a Souls-like in slightly lower graphics. You'll find your way through dungeons, hack your way through enemies, try not to die, but likely die several times as you seek to get to the bottom of what is wrong with this strange and interesting world where everybody appears to be dead, but somehow deathless at the same time. Kind of wears its inspiration on its sleeve in that regard, I would say. Either way, though, having spent some time with the demo, it's an enjoyable little game if you're into that kind of thing. I doubt it'll be of much interest to you if you are not, but if you like those kinds of games, I had fun with it, and so I figured I would mention it here. Second to last, we then have Warhammer 40k Boltgun 2. This demo has been out for a while and I have covered it, but Boltgun was a fantastic little boomer shooter, and Boltgun 2 is giving us additional options via a playable character with different weapons and loadouts and just overall abilities via a Sister of Battle. Hoping it manages to live up to the first game while also expanding some things as well, and so far that demo looks pretty promising. Again, I've made a video about it if you want more details, but looking good so far. And then last but not least, we then have a look at Dimraeth, I believe it's called. This is an interesting sort of top-down open world ARPG, if you will, that allows you to create your own little sprite via a bunch of different races and eventually classes and stuff, but in this case, the demo that is, only giving us a couple of options, one of which being a Minotaur, and we're going to hack and slash our way through an odd world after waking up seemingly immortal. A ritual went wrong, which happens to have left you personally extremely difficult to kill. Outside of the usual hacking and slashing, there's also some building mechanics and a main story you'll have to track down where you seek to get to the bottom of like why that happened with the ritual and everything, what's going on to have caused that, what is threatening the land, the usual sort of things I would imagine. But this is also a game you can play with up to 8 players in seamless co-op, which I thought was an interesting touch, and it seemed like it was doing a handful of fun things worth thinking about. But for today, I do believe that is pretty much going to do it. There's been some interesting demos I had fun messing around with as part of Steam's Next Fest in June here. If you enjoyed the video, if you have demos you'd like me to hear about, by all means, drop it down in the comment section below, which of course means to like, comment, subscribe, all the YouTube jazz. But regardless of any of that, truly, just thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate it. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.